continent and of Africans anywhere on the face of the planet, and I'm paraphrasing or adding that into it, okay? The process of colonization or the system of colonization disrupted the authentic African experience and continuity. It alienated and disconnected people from their ancestors and obscured their memory and recognition of their tribal ancestral self. Let's carry on reading. Now, since our focus in this discussion is on the shared experiences of people of African descent in the context of the United States, then the example of this group is an appropriate illustration of this dimension of the self. Now, people of the African continent, particularly of sub-Saharan Africa, have been under an almost continuous siege for the last several hundred years. Foreign invaders from Europe colonized the African continent, took our natural resources, exploited our people, ridiculed and interrupted our indigenous cultural practices. Now, the continuity with our particular cultural and ancestral lineage was painfully violated by a variety of political, as I said, still in play today, military, still in play today, economic, still in play today, even religious, still in play today, and ideological practices. The continuity with our particular cultural and ancestral lineage was painfully violated by a variety of political, military, economic, even religious, and ideological strategies. Now, this invasion constituted a psychological trauma, particularly when paired with the torturous oppression of slavery, white supremacy, and death. Let's read that again. This invasion constituted a psychological trauma, particularly when paired with the torturous oppression of slavery, white supremacy, and death. Throughout the African continent, the process of colonialism or colonization disrupted the authentic African experience and continuity. Throughout the African continent and of Africans anywhere on the face of the planet, and I'm paraphrasing or adding that into it, okay? The process of colonization or the system of colonization disrupted the authentic African experience and continuity. It alienated and disconnected people from their ancestors and obscured their memory and recognition of their tribal ancestral self. We are unable to recognize ourselves and we do not know who we are because of the process of colonization disrupting our authentic experience, African experience or African heritage experience and continuity. It alienated and disconnected us from our ancestors and obscured our memory and recognition of our tribal ancestral self. The absence of information to help us remember this part of the self and the loss of rituals to help us recall have contributed to our miseducation and our psychological trauma. The absence of information to help us remember this part of the self and the loss of rituals to help us recall have contributed to our miseducation and our psychological trauma. The result is a form of cultural disorientation and self-alienation that has produced an unnatural rejection of indigenous life practices and an equally unnatural imitation of alien invaders. Let's go again. The absence of information to help us remember if the system of colonization, racism, white supremacy, apartheid, segregation, and just the siege that we've been under for all of these hundreds of years or thousands of years, right? With that resulting in the loss of memory and the loss of rituals, which will help us to recall who we are, has led to or has contributed to our miseducation, okay, and our psychological trauma. And the result is a form of cultural disorientation, or in other words, identity confusion. Cultural disorientation. Cultural. Your culture or your identity is firmly steeped within your culture. That's where you're going to find your identity. So if you are finding your identity from someone else's culture, it's miseducation, misorientation. And if, where does it say, where does it say this? Where it says, the result is a form of cultural disorientation. Your culture, as I said, determines your identity. And therefore, if you're culturally disoriented, then you're definitely going to suffer from identity confusion. And because we do not know who we are, we do not recognize our tribal ancestral selves and our just selves in general as a group of people, okay, this leads to self-alienation that has produced an unnatural rejection of indigenous life practices and an equally unnatural imitation of alien invaders. Okay, we're usually waiting for again, our master teacher, Dr. Amos Wilson, will always tell us that as a people, we have bought into the Eurocentric myth of progress, that just because time is moving forward, or in 2024 now, I guess things are just progressing, and that it's just some kind of law that as time goes forward, things get better. Okay? But that's a myth, according to Dr. Amos Wilson, one of our master teachers, may he rest in peace, may he rest in power. He says that there is no law on the face of the planet that guarantees that things will get better as time progresses. Okay? So it means that if things are going to get better, you need to develop these things that are going to get better. And you have to be in control of developing those things that are going to help things to get better. Okay? Things don't just get better just because time is moving forward, or just because. Okay? So I hope this is beginning to make some sense, okay? And I hope I'm not over making a point, okay? But you're beginning to see how even little subtle things like opening a textbook and reading a scientific textbook, if you are someone who's studying science, or even in law, or in whatever the field it is that you're in, you will find that the ritual is that it was someone European or Eurocentric that discovered or that first initiated that thing. And that's not to say that that practice is wrong. As we've been told in this book, is that they are respectful of the standard for self-education or for education in general, which means that you have to show or shine light on you as a person, because it helps to build who you are. So you can't always rely on other people. And then we can't go and complain to those people and say, hey, I need you to represent me in your... No, it's not their responsibility. It's our responsibility. So again, those of you who want to make this out as if I'm blaming Europeans or white people, no. Again, that's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. I'm talking to people of African, Black, Caribbean heritage, regardless of where you are on the face of this planet. Okay? With regards to self-development, or those who are interested in self-development. Okay, that's who I'm speaking to. Okay? Let's carry on. So the result is a form of cultural disorientation and self-alienation that has produced an unnatural rejection of indigenous life practices and an equally unnatural imitation of alien invaders. We know many of us, I'm not even going to go because, again, many of us imitate Europeans, Asians, Chinese people because we just think that they have it made and we don't. Okay? Now, the consequence is the tremendous difficulty that modern inhabitants of Africa have in the conduct of their affairs of government and culture. One thing I did notice, I remember traveling to the Caribbean, and so I grew up in Africa, live in the West, and, live in Europe and travel to the Caribbean. And what I noticed was one day I was watching TV in the Caribbean and I looked at the Parliament. And I was like, oh, the Parliament was just like the Parliament in the UK, but the parliament in Ghana was also very much like the parliament in the UK. Odd. I mean, it's not odd, really. I mean, we know why. But just at that point in my development, I was just like, oh, okay, that's interesting. You just take note and you just keep on moving. But again, as he's saying here, that the consequence is the tremendous difficulty that modern inhabitants of Africa have in the conduct of the affairs of government and culture. So if our government or governments who are the leaders of our culture, if those people are imitating other people, then aren't we all just imitating those other people? Anyways, the corruption and self-destructive patterns that characterize the conduct of African affairs is a consequence of this tribal dimension of ourself. This does not deny the relevance of this kind of political and economic exploitation that continues to be executed by invaders. Now, the cooperation of Africans with their own exploitation is a consequence of this tribal mentality of self-rejection that has been learned from these centuries of human exploitation by non-African opportunists. The corruption and self-destructive patterns that characterize the conduct of African affairs is a consequence of this tribal dimension of ourselves, because we have neglected building or developing the tribal ancestral aspect of ourselves. We're not blaming Europeans. We're just saying that we've neglected building this tribal ancestral aspect of ourselves, okay? But this does not deny the relevance of the kind of political and economic exploitations that continues to be executed by invaders, okay? So we're not also going to be blind to the continued meddling in our affairs by foreigners or invaders, okay? The cooperation of Africans with their own exploitations, and we all do this. I'm not even gonna try and just blame African leaders. We, all of us as African people, cooperate with our own exploitation. That's a strong statement, but we all do. Okay, let me not project it onto you, but I'm certainly gonna be honest with myself and say that, and I'm not saying it's okay. I'm just saying that I recognize the behaviors and the patterns, and therefore if it is upon recognition of these patterns or these behaviors that I can then begin to change them. This is why I say that the BAO-BAB framework is a framework for the study of self. It was designed to be used as a tool to help build African organization, and break African bondage. And we do this by creating an environment where we can participate in whole systems thinking and self-observe. Okay, so that we can, when we begin to observe our actions, we can then begin to think and act as a nation, as a tribe, or a group with a whole new level of clarity. So once we can observe or recognize our actions, we can then begin to think and act as a group, which is how everyone else acts on the face of this planet. Okay. This does not deny the relevance of the kind of political and economic exploitation that continues to be executed by invaders. The cooperation of Africans with our own exploitation is a consequence of this tribal mentality of self-rejection that has been learned from these centuries of human exploitation by non-African opportunists. Similar self-destructive behaviors are also common within the African American community. The difficulty in working cooperatively and remaining focused on common objectives that would be helpful for our collective tribe or community is a symptom of the disconnection with the tribal self. Okay, why are we not doing this? Why can't we get together? Why can't we trust each other? Why don't we buy from each other? Why? There's so many whys. It's just the why means you don't understand. Master teacher explains the difficulty in working cooperatively and remaining focused on common objectives that would be helpful for our collective tribe or community is a symptom of the disconnection with the tribal self, because we've neglected to build or develop the tribal ancestral aspect of ourselves. And it's telling. Okay? So we don't have to go and blame someone else. We just introspect, look at ourselves and just say, we're the reason. We need to build our African selves. And we have master teachers who have literally told us or are telling us or have put work in already because they knew we were going to come to this point, and they were also practicing the development of the African self because they also knew that their life, or the point at which the times within which they knew they weren't going to live forever, but they knew that they weren't going to live forever physically, okay? But they knew that there were other lives, there were other Africans who were coming from the ancestral realm into this plane of existence who were going to need this work to find themselves, like myself. So some of these works that I read, some of them were written probably before I was born, but they're making sense, they're relevant to my life today, okay? So the tribal ancestral self, the African self, even when we neglect our master teachers, okay, those who have put the work in for us, when we neglect them, we're neglecting building this tribal ancestral self. And then, we have problems. Complaining, some of us are blaming this person, some of us are blaming that person. It's not really a blame game. It's just pretty much you have to know what you need to do. Fine, I can blame this person, I can blame that person, I can say they did it, she did it, he did it, they did it, whoever did it doesn't really matter. What do I need to do to solve the problem? And our master teachers have already put the work in. Let's carry on. One of the greatest challenges of correcting the miseducational process is to provide adequate information so that one is able to learn the characteristics and content of one's tribal self. This is where the study of history takes on a very direct and very important psychological implications as a tool to enlighten the self. Let me read that again. One of the greatest challenges of correcting the miseducational process is to provide adequate information so that one is able to learn the characteristics and content of one's tribal self. This is where the study of history takes on a very direct and very important psychological implications as a tool to enlighten the self. The BAO-BAB framework is a framework that definitely pushes history as one of the key tools for enlightening ourselves. Okay, so where the study of history takes on is saying that we could use history, and history is very important. History, or using history as a tool, takes on a very direct and very important psychological implication as a tool to enlighten the self. Such a process is taken for granted in situations where people control and structure their own educational system consistent with their own self-interest. The proposal that active and deliberate inclusion of the perspective, cultural and historical experiences of formerly excluded peoples raises the anger and eyebrows of people who have come to take their exclusive educational approach for granted. Anytime, as I say, Black people, or African people, or Caribbean people, or people of that heritage decide to do anything for themselves, Black Lives Matter, all of a sudden Black Lives, and now I'm not saying I support Black Lives Matter or I supported them at the time, but I'm just saying that using Black Lives Matter as an example, that when Black Lives Matter came, all of a sudden, all lives matter, or, we might have we want to, Black History Month now is the native or culturally, whatever, this always happens, and it's a pattern, and like once you begin to see it, it's just like it's what it is. So I'm not gonna wait for Europeans, Asians, Arabs, the Mongolians, whatever, people who are not of the African self. I'm not gonna wait for them to include me in their stuff. It's not their responsibility. It's not their job. It's our responsibility and our jobs. We have to build the African self. That's just what. Okay, so we have a lot of work to do. Okay. So he's saying this is where the study of history takes on a very direct and very important psychological implication as a tool to enlighten the self. Such a process is taken for granted in situations where people control and structures. Where such a process is taken for granted in situations where people control and structures their own educational system consistent with their own self-interest. Let me read that slowly. This is where the study of history takes on very direct and very important psychological implications as a tool to enlighten the self. Such a process is taken for granted in situations where people control and structure their own educational system consistent with their own self-interest. The proposal that active and deliberate inclusion of the perspective, cultural and historical experiences of formerly excluded people raises the anger and eyebrows of people who have come to take their exclusive educational approach for granted. Much of the protest about African-centered or quote-unquote Afrocentric education has come from people who are very comfortable with an educational system that teaches the content of their tribal, and that's me, he uses the word their tribal self, I'm saying their tribal self, or the tribal self of Europeans exclusively. Critics of Afrocentricity, such as journalist George Will of Newsweek in February 1996, argues that, and he's just about to give us an example of a European or someone who works for Newsweek who recognizes or who is protesting about African-centered or Afrocentric education, or complaining about African-centered education, because he has become very comfortable with an educational system that teaches the content of his tribal self. And therefore, when he begins to see someone else trying to elevate their tribal self, all of a sudden there's a problem. Okay? Anyways, what did he say? He says that Afrocentrism, quote unquote, Afrocentrism is an attempt to empower African Americans with a transforming myth. So when Africans begin to talk about history or begin to talk about anything positive about our experience, historically speaking, currently speaking, or future, it's a myth. It's a myth. Because what? You've never seen anything positive of black people? Or maybe because black people being, or African people being negatively described or ascribed is what? Helpful to your self-esteem? Do you need to see us in particular positions for you to be elevated? Let's go. He says Afrocentrism is an attempt to empower, quote unquote, African Americans with a transforming myth. But the myth is self-inflicted intellectual segregation, and the entire project is condescending to African Americans. Tell them inspiriting stories, just as parents tell moralizing fairy tales to their children. So he's making an argument that we built the pyramids and we had nations and we have organized ourselves into nations and groups and societies, very functional, before the European came into contact with us, is a myth, because he's never been taught that, okay? And whatever prejudices that creates within him, this is what we're seeing at play here, where he's saying that when Africans are telling, or black people in general, or people of African heritage are telling their stories, all of a sudden it becomes a problem, because now we're just making up lies just to feel good about ourselves. So you've heard the feel good history trope, that you guys are just saying this because you want to feel good about your history. But our master teacher is about to do something. So let's see what he does. He says, Mr. Will doesn't mention the myths of Columbus's discovery of an occupied land, or the white invasion and occupation of a black land, which they renamed as Egypt. So now it is recognized that the whole Columbus story is a myth. And even if Columbus, yes, definitely sailed and discovered that land for Europeans, but you couldn't have discovered it because other people were there before you. So if that's the case, then we can all go around the world just discovering stuff. Okay? Or the white invasion and occupation of a black land, which they renamed as Egypt, which now when we say, we come from that land, which is in Africa, is a problem for some people. Anyways. So Mr. Will doesn't mention the myths of Columbus's discovery of an occupied land, or the white invasion and occupation of a black land, which they renamed as Egypt, are such inaccurate myths, quote unquote condescending to children of European descent? Is a question he asks. So, but telling European children that Columbus discovered America, is that myth condescending to European children? Because we all know it's a lie. So who's telling lies now? Anyways, what about the mythology of Tarzan and the Dark Continent, which becomes interchangeable with the fact that when it comes to their exploitation and paternalistic intrusion into the culture of Africa? Maybe I'm too excited to explain this, but let me just take my time and read it so that I can explain it properly. Okay, what about the mythology of quote unquote Tarzan and the Dark Continent, which becomes interchangeable with fact when it comes to the exploitation and paternalistic intrusion into the culture of Africa? It seems that mythology that is inspiriting or transformative for European Americans or Europeans in general is acceptable, okay? But factual information presented from the perspective of African people and African scholarship is quote unquote self-inflicted intellectual segregation, or quote unquote it's condescending to Africans to hear of instances of their greatness. So someone's probably going to watch my videos and say, oh, here is another person who's promoting racist stuff, and you're the one who is bringing division amongst the races. Nah, you already done divided us. Now we're saying, okay, fine. If you divided us and you're saying that this is who we are and this is objectively speaking who we are, well, we're going to do and focus on the objectively divided self that you've given us. And when we begin to do that, we say, oh, look, there's positive stuff about this objectively divided self that you've given us. No, you lot are being racist for pointing that out. What? So what do you want us to do? Just what is it that you want us to do? So we're telling factual stuff, but then when we look at the stuff that you've been saying about Columbus discovering stuff or changing names and saying that somehow Egypt is not in Africa, and even if Egypt is in Africa, it could not have been built by those particular groups of people who live in Africa. But no, the Taj Mahal, no, we're not going to question that. The Eiffel Tower, we're not going to question that. The who's the woman that holds the thing in America, Liberty, the thing is Statue of Liberty, we're not going to question that. We're not going to question who built it. But when we go into Africa and we start saying, well, no, yeah, no, it couldn't have been these people because these people were primitive and they were waiting for us to come to bring the light. So anyways. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to my channel. My name is NII Atukwei. I am and I do hope to be your African-centered tutor in the very near future. My area of interest is education, specifically speaking African-centered education. And my topic of interest is knowledge of self. Now, knowledge of self is represented in the BAO-BAB framework. You can see behind me. And the BAO-BAB framework is a framework for the study of self. It was designed to be used as a tool to help us build African organization and to break African bondage. And we do this by creating an environment where we can participate in the whole systems thinking, where we can self-observe and take responsibility for our actions. When we're able to observe our actions, we can then begin to think and act as a nation, a tribe, or a group with a new level of clarity. Okay, I'd also like to say thank you for taking time out of your precious day to come and watch my videos so far. Thank you so much for those of you who have seen my first videos that I've put online so far. I am so grateful, for the feedback, and also just for the fact that people have actually seen my videos. Okay, so please keep leaving your comments. Please keep liking and sharing my videos. Thank you so much those who have shared my videos. Thank you so much to those of you who have commented. Thank you so much to those who have given me feedback. I guess I don't really know what to say, but thank you so much. Okay, so this really does mean a lot to me, and I do hope that this channel, this conversation in itself, just keeps growing amongst us and amongst our community as well. Okay, so without much ado, let me just say what I usually say without much ado. I'd like to again give a massive shout out to Father Clemson Brown and those at www.tapvideo.com. This is the source of our master teachers. Okay, this is one of the many sources, but this is one of the key sources of our master teachers. So if you do have time, please go and check out the works of Father Clemson Brown, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, Dr. Marimba Ani, Dr. Shashi McIntyre. You can find Dr. Joseph Ben Cannon and Dr. Francis Chris Welsing, Lily Fuller's work. There's so many master teachers who are on this website. Okay, so please go to www.tapvideo.com or Transatlantic Productions on YouTube, and you will find